Why, thank you, Neil. And thank you, Andy and Saul and Shira and Sam Rosen and Leslie and everybody who added their voices to the reading of sacred texts on this Shabbat Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av. There are so many wonderful things to choose from, but as it turned out, I went with what people had the most questions about in the chat, which is our Torah reading, and specifically the sound of our Torah reading and what it indicates about the story itself where we are. So I've brought us to Numbers 33, which was partway through the reading today. And it's actually where it was part of Rabbi Shira Johnston's laning. And this is the beginning of the second of our double parashiot this morning. So we have Matot and Masei. And this is a compilation of the journeys and the stops on the journeys of the children of Israel. And you see a notation of exactly where the marches by their starting points that the children of Israel went through the desert. So you get the names of all of these places, a little contextual information at the beginning, place after place, until you get to verse 10, where the sound of the reading changes. So Rabbi Shira, would you do me the huge favor of chanting a couple of these verses in the trope that is dedicated for journeys that you shared with us this morning when you were doing the Torah reading?
Sure, just maybe.
I was going to do it, but I'm so thrilled that you were already.
All right. Vayisu melim vayachanu ayamsu vayisu miyamsu vayachanu b'midbar sin vayisu mimidbar sin vayachanu bedovka vayisu midovka vayachanu be'alush.
And then yeah, go ahead, Rabbi Shira. What were you about?
Anyway, that's the one. This one is the normal one. And then
exactly.
Okay.
Are you able to chant this one just so people can hear the differentiation between the Shirat Hayam trope you were using and then going back to the regular, just to highlight that?
Vayisu me'alush vayachanu birfidim velo haya shamayim lam lishtot.
Perfect. Lovely. So did everybody hear sort of the difference between the way that Rabbi Shira chanted verse 13, the tune being ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 da, which I saw lighting up in the chat. Someone said, "Oh, am I hearing strains of like a high holiday trope?" And somebody else said, "Well, it's Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av. That's probably Eicha trope." There was a sense of like we have shifted here, but what did we shift to, and why did we do it from our normal Torah trope, which we heard for the vast majority of this parasha? So this is, in fact, Shirat Hayam trope. Nope, I don't need the resources. Thank you very much, Safaria. And this is notably, you're talking about when the children of Israel were encamped by the Sea of Reeds. And so you would think that Shirat Hayam trope would be appropriate because we're sort of mentioning the geographic location of where we sing Torah in that particular trope, in that particular musical cantillation pattern. Probably most familiar to us with the verse, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi chamocha ne'edar ba'kodesh, nora tehilot oseh feleh. But it's not only limited to places that mention Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. It's also the cantillation that we use when the children of Israel are on the move. And there are several midrashim about why this is the minhag, why this is the custom for this particular part of this particular Torah portion. You don't hear it in a lot of other places. I also want to recognize that it is not the custom of every Jewish community who reads this Torah portion to add that special cantillation. I would say that it is a majority custom, especially in Ashkenazi synagogues, but not everywhere. It's not universal, as so many of our minhagim, our customs, are not. And every place sort of determines what is its own custom. So just reminding you, friends, that though you have the ability to unmute, I would really appreciate if you would virtually raise your hand before you speak so I could keep track of who has spoken most recently, who hasn't gotten a chance to share yet, and some sort of like sense of order of what people's questions are. But why do you think that we have special music for this special section? All answers welcome, imaginative, ridiculous, very serious. Liz, why do you think we change our tune?
I'm no great musical theater or opera person, but in situations like that, you might, like if something in an opera or a musical where the creators want to remind you of something that happened before, they bring back the melody, maybe as an undertone in the new situation. So I think maybe that's what's happening here.
Lovely, a throwback. Nothing is more transportative than music. And so we are taken right back to the shore of the sea in Parshat Beshalach. And that's what we're being reminded of here. I love that interpretation. Other suggestions? Why would we change our tune? Sharon, go right ahead.
I remember learning about John Cage, and he had a piece called 33 because 33 was a special number.
Ooh.
Meaning guidance or blessings, inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
So
you think there's a special number at work here?
Well, there was with John Cage, so there could be here too.
Absolutely. And I think you're onto something, Sharon, and we're going to get into it. And notably, I don't know why it was so important to John Cage, not knowing his biography, but 33 is a very auspicious Jewish number, Lag Ba'omer Lamed Gimel, the day when the plague ceases among Rabbi Akiva's students in the counting up of the Omer is a day of great celebration. So 33 is important. And the number 42 is very significant in this parasha, which we will discuss. Saul, what are you thinking? Is it also on numerology or something entirely different?
No. It's almost like it's a reminder to say, you went through the sea and you stood at Sinai and you received the law, and you're marching. We were marching through the desert like this because we couldn't do it. We had no faith. We didn't believe in God. We were rebellious. We had no faith. We walked through the sea of reeds and saw God as best we could, and yet we couldn't do it. And they're all dying. They're all dying except, Caleb and Joshua and a few others get to go. Otherwise, a whole new generation gets to go into the land. And this is kind of like, see, I gave you a chance. And you didn't.
Nice. So as Saul points out, the story of Bamidbar, the story of this entire book, is in the desert, in the wilderness, and then its English translation, which is not a perfect translation of the word Bamidbar, is the book of Numbers. And we start with one census count of one generation, and by the end of the book, as Saul says, they're all dead, except for Caleb and Joshua, who are going to lead the children of Israel into the promised land, the leaders of a new generation. And even our great teacher, Moses, does not enter the promised land, is a representative or a relic of a previous generation. And there's some argument that the end of the book of Bamidbar is actually the end of the Torah. Deuteronomy is a total recapitulation. It just repeats what we already know. So this is where this story ends, and the new chapter is not only representative of a whole new life for the children of Israel, but a whole new generation. And so maybe this is reminding us of either the highlights reel, the time when things were good, or just a quiet reminder of that's what things could have been, but for you, they will not be. Fascinating. All right, Sarah, and then I'm gonna give us some explanations based on research.
I'm thinking like the military here. My dad was military for several decades. And I know that in the military, when people are marching and tired, they start singing marching tunes. And
Perfect.
I'm wondering if that's what's going on here, that the Israelites just don't feel like marching. So God gives them marching tunes.
I love that, Sarah. And what I also love about that is I think that not only is it true for the characters in this parasha that like they need a marching tune to keep up their spirits, but to be honest, for us as the listeners, we need a little variation in what we're hearing. Look how closely each of these sentences repeats after itself. It is basically the same grammatical construction. It is almost entirely the same words, just like fit in here the name of the place instead of the name of the other place. This can get a little exhausting to listen to, and it's going to go on for 42 stops. And so why not add a little musical variety to the story as we hear it, and how important we recognize music is in the transmission of said story and keeping our focus on the story, even when not a lot of details are offered. So what's fascinating about this is each of these places comes with its own story, right? But only on some of them is it described that, remember at Rephidim, it was there that the people had no water to drink. And so the murmuring started to gather force and volume. But each of these encampments represents one important story that our people lived through. Not all of them are related in great detail in the Torah, and maybe that's sort of a disintegration across generations. Maybe these were names that immediately lit up for their listeners very real landscapes, both internal and external. People would be much more familiar with what these places looked like, and people would be much more familiar with the stories sort of encoded in the names of these places. And now all that we have left are their names. All right, so that's a little bit about the music. We can look forward to our triennial reading of Masei next year, also for a different musical reason, which is that it has within it in chapter 35, the Karnei Para, a trope mark, a cantillation mark that only occurs once in the entire Torah and once in the book of Esther. And so in the liberal minyan, we only get to hear that once every 3 years. And there's a lot of special musical encoding with this part of the journey. But as I mentioned, there were 42 stops on the journey for the children of Israel to move from one generation to the next in their circuitous pathway towards the promised land. And I wanted to put out to the group, what does 42 mean to you? Or why do you think it took 42 stops before Israel was allowed to enter the promised land? Jeannie Heller helpfully put into the chat that Jackie Robinson's number on his jersey when he took to the field was 42. Can't promise that's where he got it from, but Liz, anything you want to say about, the sort of 6 times 7, the multiplication tables that I know is just like ingrained into me? What's so special about 7 6s or 6 7s?
Well, maybe it's, a cycle of 6 full weeks.
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
So maybe that's, some kind of completion of something, or just an easy mnemonic for people to remember.
Sure. 42 is like one of those kind of awkwardly perfect numbers. It isn't a prime number, but it's just a little out of whack. And so it's easy to stick into our minds. Margot's pointing out, 7 is a sense of completion. We see it in our aliyot structure. Doug asked, what is the gematria of 42? And Sarah was quick on the uptake to say it's a mem and a bet. Were you to switch those letters, you would have the starting 2 letters of the book of Bamidbar. The word Bamidbar does not equal 42 in gematria, so maybe this is just a convenient coincidence. And, it's imperfect, but it is so well aligned. Who read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or saw the movie based on the book by Douglas Adams? In this science fiction work, the meaning of life is 42. And so we can see in our pop cultural context that the number 42 still has some kind of resonance to us. I won't promise that it's because Douglas Adams read Parshat Matot-Masei, but apparently a lot of people were thinking the same thing. So I just wanted to show you a couple of different interpretations on why this number and why it's so important for us to remember these stops on the journey as well as their destination. So can I have a volunteer English reader, only in English? I will put the link to this Sefaria sheet that I've created in the chat if anybody wants a little bit more time for personal meditation on these commentaries. Stacy Harris, would you do us the honor of telling us what Rashi has to say about these journeys?
Switching to the reading glasses.
Thank you.
These are the journeys. Why were these journeys recorded? To inform us of the kind deeds of the omnipresent. For although God issued a decree to move them around from place to place and make them wander in the desert, you should not say they were moving about and wandering from station to station for all 40 years. And they had no rest, because there are only 42 stages. Deduct 14 of them, for they all took place in the first year, before the decree, from when they journeyed from Ramses until they arrived in Rithma,
yep.
Rithma, from where the spies were sent, as it says. Then the people journeyed from Hazeroth and camped in the desert of Paran. Send out for yourself men. And here it says, they journeyed from Hazeroth and camped at Rithmah, teaching us that Rithmah, was in the desert of Paran. Subtract a further 8 stages which took place after Aaron's death from Mount Hor to the plains of Moab during the 40th year. And you will find that throughout the 38 years, they made only 20 journeys. Rav Tahuma expounds it in another way. It is analogous to a king whose son became sick. So they took him to a faraway place to have him healed. On the way back, the father began citing all the stages of their journey, saying to him, this is where we sat, here we were cold, here you had a headache, etc.
So Rashi's a little worried that we would think that this was even for a generation that is doomed to wander, and a cruel and unusual punishment. That were they literally on the move all the time? If there were 42 places that they encamped over 40 years, they must have just been in constant motion. How exhausting. And so he does some arithmetic to say, no, you shouldn't think that like they were just wandering from station to station all 40 years. 14 of them all took place in the first year. That was even before the decree that this would not be the generation to enter the promised land. He sort of breaks it out so that 38 years, 20 journeys, not quite as intense as you might originally think on its surface. But what I love is a midrash that he includes from Rabbi Tanchuma. Think of the way that we recite to children what happened, reminding them and building into their memories a litany of, how was your day at school, dear? Well, first I did this, and then I did that, and then this happened to me. And the way that we remind our children and ourselves of the contours of our journey. The analogy is the king brings his son for healing, and on their journey back, you can hear his voice saying, this is where we sat, and here we were cold, and there you had a headache, and so on and so forth until they come home. Okay, another reader for Rabbi Aryeh ben David. This is the Kabbalistic interpretation of the number 42. Go for it, Margot.
Aryeh ben David, Around the Shabbat Table, a guide to fulfilling and meaningful Shabbat table conversations. The Zohar understands the recounting of these 42 stations on a mystical level. According to the Kabbalah, God brought the world into being by virtue of the first 42 letters of the Torah, the 42 building blocks or stages of creation. The 42 stations of travel in Masei echo the genesis of the world and reflect a second process of creation. Sounds to me when we also had that with the Beit Mikdash or the Mishkan being built.
Mm-hmm.
The 42 stations of travel in Masei echo the genesis of the world and reflect a second process of creation, one that lasted 40 years. In recounting the 42 journeys, Moses now tells Bnei Yisrael that, in fact, a new creation has occurred. The creation of the nation has paralleled that of the world.
And so there is this Kabbalistic understanding that in the story of Bereshit, in the beginning, there's an interpretation that should be read as with Reshit, with beginning. God created the world, and the source of that beginning is Torah. So Torah is literally our DNA encoded into every piece of matter that exists in creation. The first 42 letters of Torah is significant for, these are the building blocks. Imagine these are like the atoms and the molecules that build up everything else. And so we hear Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And this could be the creation of a nation and a creation of a whole new world of existence for the children of Israel. All right, last one. Can I get a reader for Rabbi Salman Mutsafi, who was an Iraqi teacher of Torah? This is from his book, Siftei Tzadikim. Stacy's offering, and I really appreciate it. Anybody who hasn't read yet, who's willing to read some English before I call on Stacy? All right, Sarah, go right ahead.
This world is called the world of repair. People always need to repair what they did in the past. Angels are said to be standing because they are always on one level, having no need to repair the past. However, human beings are always journeying between levels, and therefore the Torah says, these are the journeys of the children of Israel. Anytime the Torah says these, it refers to the undoing of earlier actions because past actions always need correcting. A wise person guards these to make sure that earlier actions are repaired.
And so this is one of the beautiful gifts of the differentiation between humans who are mortals and angels, perhaps, who are immortal, that angels have no need to repair the past. And we might read that as an aspirational statement, how lucky are angels that they don't have any mistakes that they need to go back and do teshuvah, do the work of repentance for. But the way that this rabbi interprets this is to say that angels are always standing. Angels are always on one level. They don't move between levels in their existence because there is no sense of past. And in some sense, there's no sense of future. There's just always the present. And so this is a unique gift of human beings and of mortality to say that we have a past, we have a present, and we have a future. We uniquely have the ability to move between these levels instead of existing on only one endless plane. And the curse that comes with that is we have actions that we need to return to and renew our intentions so that our future is not the same as our past or our present. And it is also a singular blessing of humanity that we have the stories of our past, actions that we once did that we don't have to do again, that we could do again, but each of those is within our power to affect and to write the story. So thank you for sharing this story with me this morning. And having a little more variation to what can look like the shape and the structure of a repetitive tale, but within each one is the opportunity for individual interpretation and for blessing. And I wish each of us much strength and much blessing to be discovered on our own journeys.